Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show where we talk about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. We're going to start off with a new item here, but it should look familiar. Rightward spiraling altered form. One of the secret letters left by copyist Carol, student of Bergenworth. This twisting cross was given the meaning of altered form. This rightward spiraling one has an effect increasing HP. The discovery of blood brought them the dream of evolution. The sickly or possibly perverse change of form is known as the first step towards that. So, last time we looked at the anti-clockwise metamorphosis rune, and now we've seen the regular clockwise version, which, as you probably noticed, has a very similar wording. In fact, the only difference in either language is in the third line, where the direction of rotation and in-game effects are specified. I bring this up for a couple of reasons, the first of which being that since these two runes share the same final lines, I can get back to the point I started to bring up at the end of the last episode. So, while we watch this boss stagger out of his chair, let's note the enigmatic approach of the official English when it comes to connecting the dream of evolution to the effects of metamorphosis. If we look at the final sentence of the Japanese, we can see that we have a number of descriptors attached to the term metamorphosis, which is identified as the subject. Then we learned that this metamorphosis was known as the first step towards that. This, of course, makes us ask the question, what exactly is the word that referring to? And then if we look back at the previous sentence, the obvious implication seems to be that the answer is the dream of evolution that the discovery of blood brought about. In other words, if I were to rework my more literal translation a bit, the Japanese seems to be saying that the sickly or possibly perverse metamorphosis is known as the first step towards their dream of evolution. Now, it's not entirely clear if the reference is to the dream of evolution or simply evolution itself, but that there is a connection to be made here is unmistakable in the Japanese. Compare that to the final line of the official translation. Metamorphosis and the excesses and deviation that followed were only the beginning. Here I think it's less clear what exactly these things are only the beginning of, which is a little surprising to me because the concept of evolution is an important one in Bloodborne. Having said that though, we've seen other instances of vague but evocative phrasing being used in the translation before. I think there's something to be said for the use of that style in this game, and the wording of the official English is a lot more striking. Also, ominously hinting that metamorphosis was only the beginning after describing the dream of evolution becoming a reality may be an effective way to make players connect the dots themselves, which is certainly more rewarding than having something spelled out. One way or the other though, it's certainly an interesting translation choice. More interesting to me than the name of this particular boss, for instance, which I wanted to briefly acknowledge since this fight won't go on forever. As you can see, it's a pretty straightforward name. But let's get back to the other reason why I started this episode with the Clockwise Metamorphosis rune, because I think these two runes, and really the Lake and Deep Sea runes too, provide a great example of how repeated text can be used in combination with game context to convey story information. Both of these runes are based on a similar form, the Twisted Cross, so both provide the effect of metamorphosis. In both cases, the bit of lore-relevant information we gain in the final set of lines is also the same, which I think emphasizes how similar these two runes really are. The only difference is in which way the twisting cross is twisted, with one direction tying into HP and another tying into stamina. The result, at least in my mind, is that stamina and HP become linked thematically, and the idea of a physical metamorphosis, the unifying factor between these two variations on the same runic shape, is emphasized. If these two runes had been different shapes with different descriptions, I don't think that underlying connection would come across nearly as well. Oh, and hooray for victory! But to get back to my point about the runes, I think you can also see this in the Lake and Deep Sea runes. The Lake runes all have a similar opening set of lines, and they improve players' defenses against different damage types. The Deep Sea runes likewise share an opening set of lines, and they improve players' defenses against status ailments. But let's not forget, all the Lake and Deep Sea runes have the same final set of lines, and they all boost players' defenses in some form, with the different types of defense grouped by different large bodies of water. And all the repetition helps put these groupings together. But how about something new? Crown of Visual Hallucination, one of the secret treasures in the possession of Cainhurst. This old crown of the king, once said to show illusions, is also the key to breaking an illusion which hides a secret. Therefore, Logarius wore this of his own volition, that no one might ever again touch upon the vile secret. What must he have seen from his freezing throne? So, there's one particular translation choice in this item description that I find a little perplexing, because I'm not sure if there's meant to be a double meaning involved or not. Before we get to that though, let's get one important bit of context out of the way. Remember how this crown is supposed to break an illusion? Well, now's our chance to see that in action. I'm afraid I'm going to talk over the big reveal though, because there's one aspect of the Japanese that the official translation might actually be hiding. You may have noticed that in my more literal version of the second line, I noted that this old crown of the king was once said to show illusions, while the official English had this as, the old king's crown is said to reveal illusions. So let's start by looking at the Japanese in question. Here we have a long phrase modifying the word kanmuri, or crown, which is identified as the subject of the sentence. Everything preceding that term is describing the effect of the crown, or at least what effect the crown was once said to have had. And the key phrase in understanding that effect is maboroshi o miru. Maboroshi pretty clearly means illusion or illusions in this case, and it's modified by the particle wo, which means it is the direct object of the following verb. That final verb is miru, which means to see. Now, it should be noted that this particular kanji is unusual, but I don't think that affects the overall point. Basically, when we recreate the phrasing from the original Japanese, we get the meaning, was once said to show illusions. In other words, whoever wears this crown apparently experiences visual hallucinations, which ties in with the item name. But hold on, I think there might be someone in this next room.
Visitor, I claim no subjects, but here lieth our throne. Kneel afore us, or get thee gone.
Right. I don't know how I feel about kneeling, but I do know you sounded a lot more imperious in the official English, but that's a point I'll come back to later. For now, I think I'll just say hello and get back to my point about the Crown of Illusions. The Japanese makes it seem pretty clear that those who wear this crown see things that aren't there. This makes sense of not only the item name, but also the last line, pondering what Logarius may have seen. It also complicates the idea that it's the key to breaking an illusion that hides a secret, because if it both displays illusions and unmasks them, how can the wearer know what's real? Having gone through all that, I think you can see why I was surprised when I saw that the official translation for this line is that the crown is said to reveal illusions, because at first that seemed to me like it was precisely the opposite of the intended meaning. That's when I remembered that reveal has another definition that in this sense could entirely resolve the issue. Turning to Merriam-Webster, the first two definitions are about secret information coming to light either through divine inspiration or more mundane means, but the third definition is to open up to view, as looking through a window might reveal a cluttered room. In this sense, to reveal illusions could be taken to mean to visually display illusions, which is completely appropriate. This is why I started out by saying this was a translation choice I find perplexing, because by one understanding of the English, it sounds as if this crown will unmask illusions, while by another understanding, it sounds like the crown will display them. It leaves a player with a certain amount of linguistic ambiguity, which I actually think makes a good contrast for the kind of ambiguity I mentioned earlier when talking about the clockwise and anti-clockwise runes. In the case of the runes, leaving out a direct connection to evolution in the final section makes the English a bit vaguer, but it's the kind of thing that keeps players wondering. What was metamorphosis only the beginning of? How does it tie in with the discovery of blood and the dream of evolution? This line in the Crown of Illusions, on the other hand, doesn't lend itself to a great deal of speculation. Either you interpret reveal to mean show, or you don't. And if you didn't, you may simply miss the idea of the crown displaying illusions to its wearer entirely. You might think about the rest of the context present in the item description and come to the right conclusion, but again, that's not the kind of logic that makes you feel like you're still wrapped up in the world of Bloodborne. And on that note, I think it's time we turned our attention to another rune, because this one certainly encourages speculation. Joy of Blood, one of the carol letters that serve as phonetic representations of inhuman voices. The joy of blood is a state in which one finds raw pleasure in the warmth of blood, and recovers HP by means of a visceral attack, a dark aspect of a hunter. This secret letter also connects with those who serve the queen who bears the child of blood. Those who long for the queen's blood find compensation in joy of blood. Again, there are a lot of things to discuss in relation to this rune, especially in that last set of lines, but I wanted to start out by saying how much I like the official name of Blood Rapture. It gets across the idea of reveling in the warmth of blood quite nicely, arguably making the concept of the rune more comprehensible than my own literal version, Joy of Blood. It also sounds a lot better to my ear and even brings in some potential religious connotations, which to me seems very fitting. Having said that, let's turn to some of the more vaguely defined aspects to be found in the final set of lines. First, there's the question of what this queen is doing with this child of blood. Now, we're already dealing with a few levels of mystery here because who the queen is supposed to be, let alone the child of blood, is entirely unclear, but let's ignore that for now and focus in on the actual verb being used. You may have noticed that in my more literal version, I said that this rune connects with the servants of the queen who bears the child of blood, but this English is actually a little deceptive. Obviously, when an English speaker makes reference to a woman bearing a child, there's pregnancy involved, but the Japanese in this instance doesn't have that same implication. The word in question is daku, or perhaps a similar word that uses the same kanji, like idaku. Both of these words have primary meanings involving holding or embracing something. They also feature different metaphorical extensions of those ideas. Idaku can refer to objects surrounding something as if being embraced. It can be a way of speaking about holding a particular belief or emotion, and it can mean to protect. Beyond its base meaning, daku can be used to refer to the way a mother hen sits on her eggs. It can serve as a reference to two people sleeping together, and it can also refer to the act of dragging someone down into sin. I wanted to go into all that because this particular word will show up in another important context later, but for now, just note that none of these senses includes an equivalent to the idea of the English phrase, bear a child. The official translation avoids this pitfall by calling the queen the carrier of the child of blood, and I thought that was worth highlighting. Sometimes in translating a phrase from one language to another, unintended meanings can slip in. Of course, what exactly it means to be the carrier of the child of blood is still vague, but so is the original Japanese, even if the original arguably sounds a bit more natural. Going back to the idea of ambiguity, this is a case where I think the intentionally mysterious nature of the source material comes through pretty well. That brings me to another vague term used in the original, one that describes the relationship between the queen's servants and this rune. In Japanese, the word being used is tsujiru, which my Daijisen Japanese dictionary has 6 different primary senses for, many of which have their own separate variations beyond that. The general idea is one of connection, but it can refer to things as basic as one path connecting to another, and as metaphorical as having a high degree of knowledge. It can refer to jokes going over well, or it can be used to express something extending all through a place or time, such as heat that lasts all year, or something that's popular all over the world. For my own literal version, I've used the basic sense of connection here, but I really like the official version of resonates. Not only does this get at what seems to me like the intended meaning of the rune speaking to the queen's servants, but it also benefits from an association with the idea of a resonant sound. Remember, these runes are meant to be transcriptions of inhuman sounds, so the idea that one would strike a chord with a similar group of people makes sense. And speaking of striking a chord with people, the last thing I wanted to bring up about this rune is all about the expression of the yearning that the servants have for the queen's blood, because this is one aspect that the official translation lingers on. You may have noticed during the translation comparison that the official version actually goes on a bit longer at the end than my more literal one, but I would argue that it's for good reason. The last line of the Japanese speaks of those who long for the queen's blood and how they find compensation in this rune. It does this in a fairly striking way, by using the verb kogareru to describe their yearning for the queen's blood. Again, my Daijisen Japanese dictionary has several different definitions listed, but the primary one, and likely the intended meaning, is that of an earnest and wholehearted longing. It describes a yearning so strong that it causes heartache. So yes, the term does translate to longing or yearning, but I would argue that there's a depth of desire in the original that doesn't quite come through. The queen's servants burn with desire for her blood, and it is in Blood Rapture that they must find a substitute, for they cannot have what they truly want. So while the official translation could potentially be seen as a bit on the wordy side, I think it actually does a great job of conveying the underlying set of emotions here. And with that, we've reached the end of another episode. We'll get back to the Vile Blood Queen soon, but in the meantime, please let me know if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for me. Thanks for watching, everyone.